A person studies the world around him with the help of the senses, as well as using various measuring instruments and instruments.
А также используя различные измерительные приборы и инструменты.
For a long time, everything that interested him could be seen, touched, or heard.
Можно было увидеть, потрогать или услышать.
Then there were such areas of science in which scientists began to investigate matter that was not directly felt by the eyes, ears, or sense of smell.
Непосредственно глазами, ушами или обонянием.
For example, electromagnetic fields. Thus, all the matter known to date can be divided into two types.
Можно разделить на два вида.
Accessible by the sensory organ of an ordinary person, and detectable only with the help of sophisticated scientific and technical equipment. True, there is still a field of mysticism and extrasensory perception, where phenomena are recorded that are inaccessible to them for studying by traditional scientific methods, nor for registering them with the senses of ordinary people. Moreover, so much information has accumulated about these phenomena that they can no longer be ignored, referring to the fact that they are all fraud of charlatans or the consequences of painful mental disorders of some abnormal people. So we will refer these phenomena to the third type, which has not yet been scientifically confirmed. The doctrine of goodwill asserts that the kind of matter that is inaccessible to the senses of an ordinary person is much more extensive than what has already been studied by science over the past 2 centuries. And that the most sensitive apparatus for exploring the still unknown world of matter is man himself, although not everyone, because he combines both the one who studies the world around him and the tools with which the study takes place.
Совмещает в себе и того, кто изучает окружающий мир, и инструменты, с помощью которых происходит изучение.
Some of which, for most of us, are in a latent, dormant state.
Спящем состоянии.
We are all well aware that in addition to ordinary people who have approximately the same abilities, there are extraordinary personalities in any group, especially such a large one as the state.
Особенно такой крупный, как государство, существуют и неординарные личности.
They stand out from others because they can do what others can't.
Что могут сделать то, чего не могут другие.
As a rule, in order to get into the number of such chosen ones, it takes many years of effort and perseverance, applied in a certain direction. For example, in sports, if you follow the coach's recommendations and strictly follow them, then after a few years of hard training, you can jump over the bar set at a 2-meter height. However, any coach will tell you that perseverance and discipline alone are not enough. We still need natural data available from birth. In particular, for high jumping, an athlete needs to have a high height. The same applies to achievements in science. In addition to perseverance, something is required that has been inherent in the child since childhood. Someone is given it, and someone is not. In the field of mysticism and extrasensory perception, it also takes many years, and much more than in sports or science, in order to develop an instrument such as the person himself, so that he could become more sensitive than ordinary people and become able to register the so-called subtle worlds. And even more important are the features available from birth. Moreover, they may not manifest for a long time. Let's agree that in terms of subtle worlds, we will understand field structures, many of which are not yet available for registration with the help of technical equipment available to scientists. Nevertheless, science has made great progress in the knowledge of field types of matter, and even pictures of the aura were obtained, which was previously known only from people with so-called paranormal abilities. For example, using the technique proposed by the Kirlian couple, it was possible to photograph radiation emanating from objects of mineral, plant, and animal origin. The most interesting result is recorded in a picture taken from a maple leaf, from which part of the upper prong was cut off. Despite the fact that it was removed, the radiation in this area continued to persist for some time. The doctrine of good will is based on information obtained from the so-called esoteric teachings. They claim that the world as we know it is built by intelligent entities, in the same way as a person builds everything he needs for his needs. The only difference is that we usually use materials already created by nature as semi-finished products, such as trees, clay, stones, metals obtained from ore. And they, in turn, are created not by some abstract blind force that we call nature, but by certain living beings, whose bodies are formed from a subtle type of field-type matter. And the building material for them are the same atoms that the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus knew about the existence of.
И строительным материалом для них являются те же самые атомы, о существовании которых знал еще древнегреческий философ Демокрит.
Accordingly, with this method of creating various objects of nature, the construction of forms is carried out not from logs or bricks, but directly from elementary particles.
А непосредственно из элементарных частиц.
And therefore, there is no need for builders to have arms, legs, and technical devices.
Руки, ноги и технические приспособления.
They can't build anything out of atoms and molecules. After all, completely different technologies for creating complex shapes are used at the micro level. There is no mystery for scientists that matter consists of energy fields. This discovery is more than 100 years old. And now it's no secret that any form that seems to us to be a dense object actually consists of the smallest atoms. And the atoms themselves are made of even smaller elementary particles, which are actually clumps of energy. It remains to add to what has been said that all atoms turn out to be living beings, having consciousness as well as a person. Only they have it much more primitive, but still sufficient to obey the controlling impulse of the building intelligent forces. This process is very similar to the creation of huge pictures in stadiums during the opening of the Olympic Games. In this image, we see how people occupy a certain place in space at the command of the head. And as a result, a huge picture of a bear cub appears on the podium of the Olympic Stadium and on the sides of it. The inscription "Good Way."
надпись «Доброго пути».
It is in this way that elementary particles form atoms, and molecules are built from atoms, and even more complex forms are created from molecules and atoms, up to such incredibly complex creatures in their internal structure as the bodies of representatives of the animal world and people. In other words, to put it quite simply, the bricks of any form are living beings who follow instructions on where to stay and for how long.
Которые выполняют указания, где им находиться и как долго.
If there were no such instructions, complex forms would not exist. For the elementary units of life in a free state repel each other and are in a chaotic state.
Отталкиваются друг от друга и пребывают в хаотическом состоянии.
Moreover, even such simple living beings as the chemical elements of the periodic table could not exist.
Не могли бы существовать.
The stable state of any of them is maintained only thanks to guiding impulses, the execution of which keeps the atomic weight of oxygen or hydrogen molecules, for example, unchanged. Esoteric teachings claim that there is no so-called dead matter in nature, for which it is customary to use the term inorganic in science. All elementary particles, atoms, molecules, as well as plant and animal cells, each of them is a unit of life with some elementary consciousness. Moreover, no matter how large a unit of life we consider, from the most microscopic to such giant cosmic beings as planets, stars and galaxies, any of them is always part of an even larger whole, a larger living being.
Любая из них всегда является частью еще большего целого, более крупного живого существа.
Yes, yes. Planets and star systems are also living beings.
Тоже являются живыми существами.
True, their consciousness is several orders of magnitude ahead of human consciousness, but in the past they, like us, have gone through a long evolutionary path. And on this path, one of the steps was connected with the development of human consciousness. The so-called monad rises up the steps of the evolutionary ladder, which is the cause that generates any form or body of a unit of life of various degrees of complexity. Now is the time to touch upon such a difficult concept for our consciousness as God. There are many very different points of view on this topic. From his complete denial to irreconcilable disputes about what he is and how he affects the world around him. Surprisingly, in the most developed countries of the world, children are taught in schools that there is no God at all.
Но в наиболее развитых странах мира детей в школах учат тому, что никакого Бога вообще не существует.
This is due to the fact that science has made an incredible leap in the study of the universe around us over the past centuries. And as a result, many of the concepts proposed by the ministers of various religious teachings turned out to be clearly untenable. The doctrine of good will assert that there really is no God in heaven with the appearance of a human being.
С внешностью напоминающего человека действительно не существует.
Just as there is no God who created the boundless space around us.
Окружающее нас беспредельное пространство.
But there is a God who created our planet specifically and supports its life.
Поддерживающий ее жизнь есть.
And in general, any cosmic being, the most enormous in size, has its own creator, whom it would be quite correct to call God.
Которого вполне корректно будет назвать Богом.
Moreover, even God, who created the Milky Way galaxy, is as mortal as man, although his lifespan is incomparably longer than the time of existence of our solar system. From the experience of everyday life, we all know very well that in order to create some complex form, it is necessary to think over the project and the technology of its implementation beforehand, prepare the necessary materials, and also find the executor of our plan. We also know that many things that have already been created require regular maintenance and repair. Otherwise, they deteriorate, fail, and cease to fulfill their purpose. All man-made products have a limited service life. And then they are either thrown into the trash or put into recycling. Why do atheists, like most modern scientists, not understand the absurdity of the appearance of such complex creatures on Earth as plants and animals, without the participation of intelligent forces? Yes, that there are animals. Even any chemical element from the periodic table is a complex creation that cannot appear by chance.
Которое не может появиться случайно.
The same applies to macrocosmic objects. The orbits of the planets and the speed of their rotation have not changed for millennia. For example, because of this, we can never see the dark side of the moon. Where does such stability come from in the micro and microcosm? Not only did the most complex forms of the organization of matter arise, allegedly under the influence of blind, uncontrollable forces, due to random interactions of a chaotic cluster of elementary particles, but for some reason, they also retain their achieved complexity for a long time, do not fall apart. It is also not clear why, after all, this stability is violated in the end, since it has existed for so long. However, many brilliant scientists did not allow the possibility of spontaneous appearance of the universe without the participation of intelligent divine forces. There are only three categories of people. Some have found God and serve Him. These people are reasonable and happy. Others have not found it or are not looking for it. These people are mad and unhappy. Still others have not found it, but are looking for it. These people are reasonable, but still unhappy. When the truth is expressed by a person, it does not mean that the truth comes from a person. Every truth is from God. It only passes through a person. If it passes through this person and not another person, it is only because this person has managed to make himself so transparent that the truth can pass through him. Shine Pascal. The heavenly Lord rules the whole world as the ruler of the universe. We marvel at Him because of His perfection, revere Him, and worship Him because of His boundless power. Out of blind physical necessity, which is always and everywhere the same, no variety could have occurred. And everything corresponding to the place and time of the diversity of created objects, which constitutes the structure and life of the universe, could only happen according to the thought and will of an original being, which I call the Lord God.
Которое я называю Господь Бог.
The wonderful structure of the cosmos and the harmony in it can only be explained by the fact that the cosmos was created according to the plan of an omniscient and omnipotent being. That's my first and last word. Isaac Newton. Only light gulps of scientific knowledge distance a person from religion and God, and deeper ones bring him back to them again. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Nature is in a sense the gospel, loudly proclaiming the creative power, wisdom, and greatness of God. And not only the heavens, but also the bowels of the earth, preach the glory of God. Mikhail Vasilyevich Lomonosov. I have never denied the existence of God. I think that the theory of evolution is quite compatible with faith. After all, it is impossible to prove that the magnificent and infinitely amazing cosmos, as well as the person in this cosmos, are completely random. Charles Darwin. For a long time, people who believe in the existence of God imagined him outwardly similar to himself. In addition, they believe that God is so omnipotent and omniscient that he knows about all the actions of any person on earth. And of course, our planet seemed to be the most important place in the universe. Although the stars in the night sky were fascinating in their beauty, they were perceived only as something secondary. And the most important creation of God was considered, of course, man. While most of the world's population was extremely ignorant and uneducated, such ideas were quite satisfactory to followers of various religions. Today, for many people, such views are not consistent with their knowledge of the structure of the universe, obtained at school and higher educational institutions. The very fact of the existence of some incomprehensible divine power is allowed even by the most outstanding and authoritative scientists. But there are no reasonable theories about what God is, consistent with their knowledge accumulated during the study of different types of matter. Before continuing our story, I would like to remind you that most of the traditional, most influential religious teachings appeared many centuries before the scientific and technological revolution that began about a few centuries ago. In conditions of mass illiteracy, it was easy for church ministers to impose on their flock the most ridiculous and primitive statements about the structure of the universe, such as that our planet Earth is flat, or that it is the center of the universe around which all the heavenly bodies revolve. As a result, over many centuries of its development, each of the world's great religions has acquired so many dogmas and erroneous concepts, later refuted by scientists, that the pendulum of history has swung in the opposite direction. Educational institutions of the most developed countries began to base their curricula on atheistic views, and a kind of materialism began to gain strength in which scientific hypotheses of the origin of the universe could easily do without the participation of God. All these hypotheses include quite reasonable statements that the most perfect product of nature, man, appeared as a result of evolution, that many changes in the external form of man or animals occurred as a result of their adaptation to environmental conditions.
Или животных происходили вследствие их приспосабливания к условиям окружающей среды.
Scientists describe many things correctly and logically, but the most fundamental statements are extremely ridiculous.
Крайне нелепы.
For example, that the so-called Big Bang can cause the spontaneous generation of such complex objects as atoms, molecules, star systems, and galaxies.
Как атомы, молекулы, звездные системы и галактики.
However, the belief in a humanoid God who created an immense cosmic world with millions of stars twinkling overhead in the night sky is just as absurd.
Столь же абсурдно.
To make sure of this, let's see what place our planet occupies in outer space.
Наша планета в космическом пространстве.
If you look at the solar system as a whole, the lower part of the picture, then even in such a relatively limited area of the universe, our planet will no longer be visible.
Нашей планеты уже не будет видно.
And only by enlarging a small fragment of this scheme, inside which only the planets closest to the Sun are located, the upper part of the picture, we will see a small circle depicting the Earth. Then let's look at the Milky Way galaxy. Now it will be difficult to detect the entire solar system inside it. It will be so small among many other stars. After such a gigantic scale, let's return to religious dogmas. He tries to convince us that Krishna or Jesus Christ are involved in the creation of this immense cosmic greatness. That in all this vast number of stellar worlds and galaxies, one single planet Earth was chosen, and only intelligent beings were created on it, in direct contact with which God at a certain historical stage of their development decided to enter, using an ordinary human body for this purpose. So, if we take the dogmas implanted by the clergy literally, then it will be difficult to agree with many of them.
То со многими из них будет трудно согласиться.
But is it worth it on the basis of this not to take into account all the statements imprinted in the scriptures at all?
Запечатленные в священных писаниях.
Esoteric teachings insist that if we perceive everything described in the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita as a symbolic reflection of the truth, it will be possible to discover in them a huge amount of the deepest knowledge in its wisdom.
Огромное количество глубочайших по своей мудрости знаний.
This also applies to the well-known words from the Bible that man was created in the image and likeness of God. In a slightly different form, the same idea was known in ancient Egypt, both upstairs and downstairs. And in ancient Greece, know yourself, and you will know the world. In esotericism, the most fundamental formula about the similarity of the microcosm of man is added to these familiar statements to all of us.
О подобии микрокосма человека,
the microcosm universe.
Вселенной.
In order to make sure of its plausibility, let's look at how the Mahatmas, the greatest sages who have ever existed on our planet, describe the structure of the universe.
Величайшие мудрецы из когда-либо существовавших на нашей планете.
For a long time, they did not advertise their knowledge and wisdom. But in the middle of the 19th century, through his trusted disciple Elena Petrovna Blavatsky. The Mahatmas first declared their existence and gave out many secret knowledge to the public.
И выдали многие сокровенные знания в публичный доступ.
According to the teachings of the Mahatmas, in addition to the well-studied medicine of the physical body, a person has other, more subtle bodies.
И другие, более тонкие тела.
All of them are created, like a dense body, from matter. In this sense, Mahatmas are, as well as representatives of science, materialists. But this matter has even higher vibrations than electromagnetic fields. Therefore, it is not yet possible to fix it with the technical devices currently available to scientists. Just as it was relatively recently, several centuries ago, it was impossible to register electromagnetic radiation, except with a primitive compass needle. Nevertheless, even with the more subtle bodies attributed by atheists to the field of idealistic beliefs, a person is well acquainted, although not with everyone. For example, we have some information about the subtle world, thanks to dreams, sometimes stored in memory after waking up. And the existence of the soul manifests itself in many of us in the form of pangs of conscience and the sense of responsibility that evolutionarily advanced people have. The table below shows a simplified diagram depicting worlds with matter differing in degree of density in the form of a puff pie. This, of course, is only a symbolic reflection of reality. In fact, all these worlds interpenetrate each other and coexist at any point in space. It's like water poured into a bucket with sand or stones takes up its entire volume. But for clarity, we will depict them on top of each other. The left column shows symbolic images of dense and thinner human bodies. In the column on the far right, the names used by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky are given. They were taken from Eastern philosophical teachings, because in the West there was no suitable equivalent for some of them. The most studied of all subtle bodies is the etheric double, or linga sharira, as it is otherwise called Mahatma. It is this shell of ours that is accessible to the vision of psychics, and is described in detail in numerous ancient manuscripts of India and China. In Christianity, the details about the 7 energy centers chakras located along the spine, although not reflected in religious literature, but nevertheless, the image of a halo around the head of the saints, and even more so of Christ and his apostles, are present in abundance in all Catholic and Orthodox churches. The emotional body Kama Rupa is connected with the world of human experiences that arise when he perceives various events in the outside world or inside consciousness. Especially strong emotions, as a rule, arise in the process of communication between people during the successful or, conversely, unsuccessful development of any significant events, as well as when perceiving some works of art. Often in esoteric literature, this shell is also called astral. So sometimes you can use this term. The mental body, the lower man's, is our intelligence with which we solve mathematical problems, play chess, and make our plans for the future. Thinking is most effective when emotions are completely calmed down and the physical body is either motionless or performs some actions purely automatically, like walking in nature.
Действия чисто автоматически, вроде пешей прогулки на природе.
And it is also important that we are not distracted by various information influences from the outside world, radio, television, loud conversations, as well as the physiological urges of the body, severe hunger, the need to empty the bladder, drowsiness or acute pain.
Сонливое состояние или острая боль.
Let's illustrate this with the following examples. The comic plots shown in these pictures by the talented Danish artist Bitstrup very vividly demonstrate the manifestation of the mental and astral shells. At the same time, the author very accurately noted that the riot of negative emotions is quite often accompanied by simultaneous violent activity of the physical body. And immersion in the thought process, on the contrary, leads to immobility and peace. Together, all of the above bodies form a person's personality, which is formed from the moment of conception of a child and ends its existence some time after death.
Через некоторое время после смерти.
The dense shell begins to decompose first.
Плотная оболочка.
This process is well known and does not require any comments. The rest of the body continues to function after cardiac arrest. Those who have experienced a state of clinical death sometimes retain the memory of how they found themselves in an unusual flesh for them and looked at it as an external object. About this, medical workers have accumulated quite a lot of evidence from their patients who have returned from a similar state to life. Then a somewhat unusual life begins for the deceased person. He finds himself in such conditions when there is no need to eat, sleep, perform family or social duties for suffering patients. The feeling of pain associated with violations of the normal functioning of their body disappears. In fact, this state is no different from sleep. Only the sleeper never wakes up, because the connection with the dense body is forever severed. Gradually, the deceased gets used to the new conditions. But after a while, death also occurs in its thinner shells. At the same time, the soul separates from them, and they begin to decompose in the same way as a dense corpse buried in the ground, or buried in some other way. The area in which the individual immortal soul functions, the fiery body between periodically recurring incarnations, is called, in the esoteric teachings of Deva Chan, and in the Christian religion another term is used, the kingdom of heaven.
А в христианской религии применяется другой термин – Царствие Небесное.
Esoteric teachings do not share the faith of a follower, and Christianity or Islam, the resurrection of a dead dense body, after some upcoming event in the future called the end of the world. Mahatmas look at the temporary shells of the personality of any person only as tools for the contact of the soul, with different layers of matter. As humanity evolves, these tools are constantly being improved, just as cars or computers become obsolete every decade and are replaced by new models. Only the improvement of human shells requires incomparably more time than human bodies in terms of their use, resemble some machines and apparatuses designed by designers and assembled by workers at the factory.
напоминают некоторые машины и аппараты, спроектированные конструкторами и собранные рабочими на заводе.
For example, in order to move through the air, you need to use an airplane or helicopter. To dive into the depths of the seas and oceans, you need to be inside a submarine. In the same way, in order for the soul to explore denser worlds and gain experience of interacting with them, mental, emotional, and physical bodies are created. Sometimes they are also compared with clothes that correspond to the conditions and customs of a particular historical and geographical environment. After all, clothes are not the person himself. The same can be said about the personality that has existed for several decades. She's just a temporary garment for the soul. In esotericism, the language of symbols is widely used to describe complex phenomena that are difficult for students to perceive. In particular, for the graphic representation of the soul, the immortal individuality of a person, a triangle is used, the vertices of which symbolize the Atma, Buddhi, and the Supreme Manas. And for the image of the personality, a square is used. Mahatma asserts that from early childhood, the personalities of all people differ in the degree of evolutionary development. Geniuses in science and art, or saints in religions, for example, become only those who have accumulated richer life experience and wisdom in previous lives. Without them, even the most favorable external circumstances will not help. The best possible parents and the most talented teachers. Conversely, a developed soul will be able to live a bright, outstanding life, starting it even in the most difficult and unfavorable conditions. To explain this idea, we use the following simple drawing. Each of us has a large number of lives behind us. We were born in different parts of the world, in different social conditions, engaged in different fields of activity. And we have passed this evolutionary path with very different results in terms of quality. Someone can be considered an excellent student, someone is average, and someone is a two-biter. The measure of success in this regard is the so-called fiery accumulations in the bowl, which are referred to in the Bible as treasures in heaven. You do not collect treasures on the earth, where moths and rye are exterminated, and where thieves dig up and steal. But gather treasure for yourself in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not dig and steal. For where your treasure is, your heart will be there. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 6 verse 19, on the given higher scheme, the triangle can be represented, conditionally. Two vessels in which during the next incarnation, these treasures accumulate in the form of a moisture of positive experience. In different religions and philosophies, there are some peculiarities in the interpretation of which experience should be considered positive. But there is also a lot in common, what is called universal values. Kindness, sincerity, honesty, decency, selflessness, selfless service to his people, and to humanity as a whole. The best confirmation of the law on reincarnation is a visit to a kindergarten. In any of them, you will find kids in whose eyes you can easily see what his evolutionary status is. He is an excellent student, an average person, or a 2-year student. If we return to the symbolism of the above scheme, then the kids will differ in the fullness of the triangular vessel. Some will have only a thin layer of water on the very bottom, while others will have much more of it. However, there is more concrete evidence that people have previous incarnations. Over the past couple of centuries, articles have appeared in the press more than once about cases when a child remembered his past life. And sometimes a relatively short time has passed since his death, so this information could be verified. He called the names of relatives, made drawings of the place where he lived, recalled some details that no one else could have found out about, except for the deceased with whom he identified himself. And the relatives and acquaintances who remained alive by that time confirmed the correctness of everything told. Of course, it can be assumed that some of these cases were fraud, but some of them could not be staged, for a number of completely objective reasons. And the fact that there is not much information about such cases in the West is explained by the fact that they contradict both the scientific atheistic and Christian Muslim beliefs of the most influential people in society, that a person lives only once, and therefore they try not to advertise them. The doctrine of good will asserts that not only a person, but in general any unit of life, always consists of an invisible cause and a visible effect. The first is the unmanifested state of a living being, the second is manifested. The first is an idea, a plan. The second is their implementation in a dense environment. The first one contains the energy for the realization of the plan. The second one contains the material that makes the idea come to life. The plan is generated by the architect in the unmanifested and executed by the builders in the manifested. The visible consequence is a form that grows out of a small grain. Any form has a limited lifetime, even if it seems almost infinite to a person, as in the case of a galaxy that has existed for many billions of years. This period can be divided into several cycles. The uterine period is an unmanifested state of birth, infancy, childhood, adolescence, reaching adulthood, aging, decrepitude, death, and decomposition.
Достижение взрослого возраста, старение, дряхлость, смерть и разложение.
Any form has a limited space for its existence, even if it seems almost limitless to a person, as in the case of the universe.
Даже если оно кажется человеку почти беспредельным, как в случае с Вселенной.
After manifestation, the form grows and expands, then reaches a stable value, and after death, it disintegrates, making room for new forms.
Распадается, освобождая место для новых форм.
In this scheme, as before, the worlds of cause and effect are located on top of each other purely conditionally. In addition, since this is a simplified scheme, spirit and soul merge into a single whole here. but it would
Но
be
более
more correct
правильно
to separate them.
было бы их разделить.
Then
Тогда
the picture
картинка
as applied to
применительно
a
к
person
человеку
will look like
будет
this.
выглядеть следующим образом.
In order
Для
for
того, чтобы
students
у
of esoteric
изучающих
teachings
эзотерические
not
учения
to have a literal
не
understanding of the
возникало
concept of
буквального
up and
понимания
down,
понятия
in relation
«вверх»
to
и
the
«низ»
spiritual world,
по
the
отношению к
kingdom of
духовному миру,
heaven, and the world of
Царству
forms,
Небесному,
as something
и миру
located
форм,
above and under their feet.
как
Another
чему-то
type of picture
расположенному
with the same
над
figures is
головой
also
и под
used.
ногами, применяется и другой тип картинки с теми же фигурами.
In this
В таком
variant,
варианте
the worlds are called
миры
external
называются
and internal
внешними
in
и
relation to each
внутренними
other,
по
which are
отношению
also
друг к
just
другу,
symbolic expressions.
что тоже всего лишь символические выражения.
Any unit
Любая
of
единица
life,
жизни,
a chemical element of the periodic table,
химический элемент
a plant
таблицы
or animal
Менделеева,
cell, a person,
и
a
растительная
planet,
или
a
животная
solar
клетка,
system,
и
a
человек, и
galaxy,
планета, и
and God
Солнечная
are
система, и
arranged according to
галактика,
the same
и
basic
Бог
scheme.
устроены по одной и той же принципиальной схеме.
Each of them
Каждую
can be
из них
called a
можно
living
назвать
atom, the dense
живым
form of which is
атомом.
built around the nucleus,
Плотная
and is
форма которого
animated by the
строится вокруг
energies
ядра,
received by the nucleus from the finer
а
planes of matter.
оживляется за счет энергий, принимаемых ядром с более тонких планов материи.
As
Пока
long
эти
as
энергии
these energies
поступают,
arrive, the atom
атом
lives,
живет,
that is, it
то
retains
есть
the
сохраняет
integrity of its
целостность
dense
своей
form.
плотной формы.
When the
Когда
energy stops
энергии
flowing, the
перестают
atom
поступать,
breaks up into its constituent
атом
parts.
распадается на составляющие его части.
In
У
humans,
человека
the functions of the
функции ядра
nucleus of the
плотной
dense
оболочки
shell are
выполняют
performed by
мозг,
the brain located
расположенный
inside
внутри
the skull
черепа
and
и
along the
вдоль
spine,
позвоночника,
as well as the
а
heart.
также сердце.
Any form
Любая
has a
форма
boundary, called
имеет
in esoteric
границу,
teachings do not proceed to the
называемую
ring.
в эзотерических учениях «не приступи к кольцу».
This is
Это
a rather
довольно
capacious
ёмкий
term
термин,
that has different
имеющий
interpretations
различные
depending on the
трактовки
context in which
в
it is used.
зависимости от контекста, в котором он применяется.
The border may be
Граница
pronounced
может
and
быть
clearly
ярко
distinguishable,
выраженной
or it may be
и
invisible to
явно
the human eye,
различаемой,
as in the case
а
of the
может
shells
быть
of thinner
незримой
bodies,
для
but
человеческого
the meaning
глаза,
of this concept is
как в
always
случае
about the
оболочек
same.
более тонких тел. Но смысл этого понятия всегда примерно одинаковый.
This is
Это
what
то,
separates one form
что
from another.
отделяет одну форму от другой.
This scheme
Данную
can also
схему
be used to depict any
можно
of the shells of a
применять
unit of life within
и для
only one of the
изображения
worlds, as
какой-либо из
esotericists
оболочек
say,
единицы жизни в
horizontally.
пределах только одного из миров, как говорят эзотерики, по горизонтали.
For
Например,
example,
для
for a
плотного
dense
тела
human
человека
body,
не
it is
приступи
not
к
an
кольцу,
attack, it is its
это его
skin and
кожный и
hair,
волосяной
but for a
покров,
plant or animal cell,
а для клетки
it is its
растения или
membrane.
животного это ее мембрана.
But the
Но
same
эта же
scheme
схема
can also serve as a symbolic
может
image of
служить
the soul,
и
a yellow
символическим
circle in the center,
изображением души,
as well as the shells of a person's
желтый круг в
personality,
центре,
which are,
а
as it
также
were, more
оболочек
dense
личности
clothing.
человека,
Let's recall the
которые
symbolism of the
являются
Russian matryoshka
как бы
doll
более
for
плотной
immortal
одеждой.
individuality in this way. It will be an
Вспомним
image of
символизм
several
русской
worlds
матрешки
vertically.
для бессмертной индивидуальности. В таком ключе это будет изображением нескольких миров по вертикали.
Only at the
Только
same
при этом
time,
не нужно
one should
никогда
never
забывать,
forget that any
что
scheme
любая
serves
схема
only as a temporary
служит
model
лишь
that
временной
allows one
моделью,
to understand the idea being
позволяющей
presented.
понять излагаемую мысль.
Therefore,
Поэтому
it
не
is not
стоит
necessary
воспринимать
to
ее
take it too literally and
слишком уж
dogmatically.
буквально и догматично.
Elena
Елена
Petrovna
Петровна
Blavatsky
Блаватская
wrote in the third
в
volume
третьем
of the
томе
Secret
«Тайной
Doctrine,
доктрины» писала:
the diagrams
диаграммы
were intended only to introduce
предназначались
students
лишь
to
для
the
того,
leading
чтобы
ideas of
ознакомить
occult
учеников с ведущими
correspondences.
идеями оккультных соответствий,
Since the
так как
very
сам
spirit
дух
of metaphysical or
метафизического или
macrocosmic or
макрокосмического
spiritual
или
occultism
духовного оккультизма
forbids the use of drawings or even symbols
запрещает
more than just as
применение
temporary
рисунков
aids.
или даже символов более чем только в качестве временных пособий.
As soon as an idea is put into words, it loses its reality.
Она теряет свою реальность.
As soon as you depict a metaphysical idea, you materialize its spirit.
Вы материализуете ее дух.
Drawings should be used only as assault ladders for climbing the fortress walls.
Штурмовых лестниц для влезания на крепостные стены.
Ladders that are neglected as soon as the foot has entered the shaft. The biggest confusion when considering the topic of God exists today in the minds of representatives of different religions, due to the fact that the same word is applied to completely different divine beings on their evolutionary level.
Из-за того, что одно и то же слово применяют к совершенно различным по своему эволюционному уровню божественным существам.
If we use the scheme already used earlier to explain this issue, then these differences will be very clear.
То отличия эти будут очень наглядными.
Such great spiritual leaders of mankind as Krishna, Buddha, Christ, and some others are only one step higher than man.
И некоторые другие находятся всего на одну ступень выше, чем человек.
This is not so little, if we recall how much more primitive the underlying kingdoms of nature known to us are in relation to each other.
Являются известные нам нижележащие царства природы.
Animals versus humans, plants versus animals, minerals versus plants.
Животными, минералы по сравнению с растениями.
The Mahatmas have completed the human stage of development and continue their evolution in the fiery or higher worlds.
В огненном или более высших мирах.
They no longer incarnate in denser worlds, except in cases when there is a need to help humanity with their personal example and word.
Когда возникает необходимость оказать помощь человечеству своим личным примером и словом.
It is most correct to call the Heavenly Father not the creator of the earth, the solar system, the galaxy, or the entire universe, but the fiery body of the Mahatma, with whom some spiritually advanced people can communicate.
С которым могут вступать в общение некоторые духовно продвинутые люди.
When Jesus Christ or Moses prayed to God, it was either their own fiery body or the fiery body of the elder Mahatma.
Огненное тело или огненное тело старшего Махатмы.
Such a position exists in the overlying spiritual realm of nature, the fifth, if we count from the mineral.
Пятом, если считать от минерального.
In order to make it visible to some people, the Mahatma is enveloped in denser matter.
Окутывается более плотной материей.
In the East, such a body shining with the brightest light is called Mayavi Rupa.
Называют Майяви Рупа.
The degree of compaction of the Mayavi Rupa can be different, up to one that looks no different from the human body.
Вплоть до такой, которая внешне ничем не отличается от человеческого тела.
The only feature in this case will be the saturation of the light emissions of the aura. The Mahatma's aura around the body and head is significantly brighter than even very advanced people. This is clearly seen in the painting of Nicholas Roerich, Fiat Rex. There are many references in the Bible about how the prophets communicated with God or saw angels and archangels. All this has nothing to do with God as the creator of the universe, which is narrated by the first lines of the Old Testament and the Gospel of John. Even the logos of the solar system cannot communicate with such a God. His evolutionary status is so insignificant in comparison with much more perfect divine beings.
С еще гораздо более совершенными божественными существами.
What can we say about a person who is just a small cell in the body of the planetary logos of the Earth?
маленькой клеточкой в теле планетарного логоса Земли.
So all these biblical stories describe contact with Mayami Rupa, one of the great teachers of humanity, as they are sometimes called in historical teachings.
Как их иногда называют в исторических учениях.
And the fact that angels and archangels are depicted with wings on Christian icons is just a distorted image of the cocoon of the Mahatma's aura.
Искаженное изображение кокона ауры Махатмы.
Since the radiation from the upper energy centers located to the head is significantly brighter than from the aura as a whole.
Ярче, чем от ауры в целом.
The halo carves wings into this larger oval.
Крылья.
But in fact, of course, there are no wings that can be flapped, as birds do.
Нет.
It is already the imagination of artists that has developed this symbol of separation from the earthly plane and flight to heaven. In the teaching of living ethics, The Fiery World is One, paragraph 64, there is such a quote. Read about the most diverse visions of fiery beings in countries around the world and find the same signs and consequences in them.
И найдете в них те же признаки и следствия.
Truly, before the higher world, all the differences of peoples disappear. People equally feel the breath of the higher world. They are equally trembling in heart and body. They understand the eye of the bright ambassador. They hardly return to their usual earthly state. They never forget such a phenomenon and the delight of the Spirit from touching the Supreme Being. It should not be forgotten that the most diverse peoples have seen higher beings in the same form. Isn't this a sign of the unity of light and the hierarchy of good? There is such a feature in the study of various phenomena and subjects that after reaching a certain degree of complexity in the presentation of knowledge, it becomes impossible to explain further details to the student. Let's explain this idea using the example of a numeric axis. Let's ask ourselves a question. What is a lot? For example, what is a lot of money? For a child, this is the amount for which you can buy a lot of sweets or toys. For a schoolboy, this is when he can buy a bicycle, skates, or an inexpensive watch. For a student or a young engineer, this is the amount that will be enough for a car, a small apartment, and a trip around the world. For a businessman, this is when you can buy a luxury mansion, a prestigious car brand, and rent an office in the center of a large metropolis. And for a major oligarch, when a large property in the center of London or New York is available, a huge yacht, and a palace on the seashore with a private plane. We see the relativity of this concept a lot. Using this example, it becomes clear that for some people, it does not make sense to talk about how the purchasing power of $1 million differs from $1 billion. Most of the inhabitants of undeveloped countries have never had even $1,000. For many of them, even $100 is a lot. Exactly the same situation exists in the field of religions. Only there the word God is used a lot instead of the word
используется слово «Бог».
After all, for most believers, even a Mahatma with superhuman abilities is perceived as a god.
Воспринимается как Бог.
One of the prophets saw the shining Miami Rupa of Mahatma, felt telepathic treatment with predictions of the future, and decided that he was communicating with God.
И решил, что он общается с Богом.
At the same time, for religious people, there is no significant difference between the phenomena that the apostles of Jesus Christ saw with their own eyes and the creation of a huge universe with many galaxies in 7 days.
Сотворением за 7 дней огромный со множеством галактик Вселенной.
Both are miracles. Both are available only to God.
Доступно только Богу.
Let's consider a table that shows how, as humanity evolved, the understanding of the divine principle expanded.
Расширялось понимание божественного начала.
The greatest breakthrough in these ideas occurred in the middle of the 19th century, thanks to the fundamental philosophical works written by the above-mentioned Elena Petrovna Blavatsky.
Уже упомянутой чуть выше Еленой Петровной Блаватской.
For the first time, the general public was given knowledge about the structure of the universe, corresponding in its level to the most advanced discoveries of scientists. However, the understanding of the knowledge presented was very difficult due to the large number of Eastern terms that were not translated into European languages. Therefore, in the first half of the 20th century, the Mahatmas made a second attempt to expand the consciousness of mankind beyond the limits of the dense physical world studied by science. At the same time, Alice Bailey, who had been engaged in Christian missionary activity for a long time, was chosen as an intermediary. As a result, the esoteric treatises recorded by her correspond to a much greater extent to the Western type of thinking. Let's look at how humanity's ideas about matter have changed based on the widest scale available to us today, thanks to the treatises of Alice Bailey. This scale reveals the structure of the universe much more widely than the ideas received through Elena Petrovna Blavatsky. Although some hints about cosmic plans were given already in the third volume of the Secret Doctrine. 7 cosmic planes are highlighted in yellow in the table, from the matter of which the shells of the spirit, soul, and personality of our solar logos are built. The 7 planes of the solar system are highlighted in blue, from the matter of which the shells of the spirit, soul, and personality of a person are built. They were previously shown in simplified form in table number 1. The 7 sublanes of the physical plan of the solar system are highlighted in pink, of which only the 4 densest are still available for scientists to study. It remains to add that for the solar logos, even the most subtle from the point of view of man, the fiery worlds are only the coarsest matter from which his densest shell is built. The rightmost column of Table 3 is a clear illustration of the operation of the most important esoteric law of similarity, of the microcosm-macrocosm. Both man and the solar logos have a spirit, a soul, and a temporary reincarnating personality. This is where their similarity lies, and not in the external similarity of dense physical bodies. A good symbol demonstrating the actions of this law are pictures of fractals, the mathematical model of which was described relatively recently by the famous French scientist Benoit Mandelbrot.
известный французский ученый Бенуа Мандельброт.
It was he who introduced the term fractal to describe objects whose structure repeats itself many times, during the transition to smaller and smaller scales. A very important conclusion follows from the law of similarity. It must be recognized that no matter how high we climb the ladder of evolutionary development, it is impossible to reach either zero or infinity. After all, no matter what small unit of life we consider, it will always consist of even smaller components. And similarly in the other direction, any most significant unit of life accessible to our understanding will always be only a part of an even larger whole. In the East, since ancient times, the sages realized this fact, and therefore called the cause of the entire boundless universe the word absolute. Gods, they called all those beings who, although much ahead of man in their development, still have a limited lifespan. And there are a lot of them. All of the above applies not only to the size of the physical shells of any beings, but also to the more subtle worlds, to the kingdom of heaven, as Christian ministers of the Church would say. The biblical staircase supposedly serves as a wonderful symbol of the infinity of worlds vertically. You just need to understand that there is no top of this ladder. God the Father really exists. This is our planetary logos of the earth, in whose body we live and move and exist. But of course, human appearance has nothing to do with him, and he is not located at the top of the evolutionary ladder, but only a few steps above man. However, these words are only a few steps very relative. From the point of view of the logos of the galaxy, the distance is not great, but it will take many millions of years for the average representative of humanity to reach such a level of development. Esoteric teachings state that any evolutionary progress is carried out during repetitive cycles. A large cycle always consists of smaller ones. Similar steps on the stairs allegedly consist of smaller steps. Let's take a closer look at a fragment of this ladder related to the evolution of mankind. The steps of the ladder are, as it were, the classes of the school of life, which must necessarily be passed from bottom to top. Naturally, it is impossible to do this in one lifetime. But given the fact of the immortality of the human soul and the operation of the law of reincarnation, there is quite a lot of time for training. In addition, undeveloped souls are reincarnated almost without a break, without holidays in the case of Chan. And for them, there are always many vacant places of birth in the families of the uneducated masses of the people, in accordance with the saying on the senka and the hat. True, there are cases when developed souls incarnate in similar conditions, but this is rather an exception to the rule. The most appropriate term to describe the most diverse classes of education in the school of life is the word egregor. It is now used by many authors writing on so-called esoteric topics, but with a slightly different interpretation.
Но с несколько отличающейся интерпретацией.
In the doctrine of goodwill, an egregor is understood as any group association animated from the subtle worlds.
Оживляемое из тонких миров.
An egregor, like an individual, always has several phases of its development.
Всегда существует несколько фаз его развития.
Childhood and youth, the growth of a thin and dense form of reaching adulthood, old age and death inevitably following it.
Старость и неизбежно следующая за ней смерть.
At first, this term was applied only to religious associations, and, as a rule, in a negative sense. It was quite rightly noted that the zombifying effect of a subtle thought form of some sect on followers. So the sectarians become blind and deaf to any arguments from the outside. At the same time, criticism primarily falls, of course, on the creators of sects. They are accused of abusing the free will of attracted people for selfish purposes. But in fact, any group is a zombie egregor in relation to the majority of its active members. And the degree of self-interest of its creators, or altruism, is very relative. The term sect can also be attributed to any recently emerged group that has a strong passionarity. According to Lev Nikolaevich Gumilev, traditionally it was used as a rule in the religious field. And in this sense, all the world's religions, which have become authoritative and respected over many centuries of their development, began with the stage when they were considered sects. Even such great founders of religion as Gautama Buddha, Jesus Christ, during the creation of their egregors, were not recognized by the authorities of the most influential religious teachings of that time, the Brahmins and Pharisees. What can we say about the leaders of a lesser evolutionary rank? At all times, they were actively resisted, up to physical violence. All of the above applies to sects in other spheres of human activity. Then, for example, a non-totalitarian sect, a political organization of the 19th century, the People's Will. And wasn't it a sect at the time of its appearance, the Impressionists, or, even more so, the Abstractionists in painting? And genetics in the time of Stalin. And the businessman Mavrodi, with his financial pyramid, attacking our consciousness on television with the help of advertising, in the post-perestroika years. And the therapeutic sessions of Kashpirovsky and Chumik. It can be enumerated endlessly. Moreover, it is not always immediately clear whether this sect will have a positive meaning in history or a negative one. And sometimes, even after many centuries, the historical process treats some of the brightest personalities, who have had a powerful influence, quite the opposite. Cortés, for example, conquered Mexico and destroyed the state of the Aztecs. Positive or negative hero? The most significant distinguishing feature of the sect is the violation by its activists of generally accepted ideas and orders. People are used to certain postulates with which they have lived most of their lives. Often these postulates have been considered correct for many centuries. Many worldwide authorities have relied on these foundations. And suddenly, a certain bright, outstanding personality appears and gathers around him adherents of his completely new, unconventional views. And his ideas destroy the pillars of the seemingly unshakable building of previous knowledge. Cracks begin to appear in the ceilings of this building, its walls tilt, and finally, the building collapses with a roar. Sometimes this process happens rapidly, sometimes very slowly and gradually. For example, for a long time in medieval Europe, it was believed that the Earth was flat and located at the center of the universe. Giordano Bruno had to pay with his life to change such ideas. And how many other discoveries made their way through the torments and sufferings of those who dared to go against established dogmas? So, a sect is just one of the varieties of egregores characterized by the novelty and strangeness of their ideas. Erroneous and unacceptable from the point of view of the surrounding conservative majority of people. In any sphere of life, sectarians are trying to put in the Procrustean bed of generally accepted ideas about what is right and what is wrong. Sectarians, in turn, are sincerely convinced that they are right and everyone else is wrong. And the truth is that for people of different levels of development, the content of the concepts of right and wrong may differ. And that's why they need classes of different levels to study at the school of life. These educational classes are egregores, such as, for example, a totalitarian and democratic type of state, social strata of the rich and poor, humanitarian and technical professions, exoteric religions and esoteric societies, power structures and service sectors, managers' offices and industrial production workshops, monasteries and prisons, tourist routes and hospital beds.
Офисы управленцев и цеха промышленного производства, монастыри и тюрьмы, туристические маршруты и больничные койки.
Let's consider a diagram showing how any new spiritual egregor is born. From the fiery body of the invisible teacher, ideas are sent to the fiery body of the potential leader of the future egregor, which the Mahatmas would like to bring down into the world of people. He accepts them, passing them through the prism of his consciousness, and thereby transforming them according to the level of his development. Then he radiates the resulting thought forms into the world around him. Clear mental images, at the same time, have magnetic properties. They attract people who think in much the same way, but not as powerfully. Such people feel sympathy for the one who expressed their fragmentary vague understandings so vividly and convincingly. As a result, there is a small group of like-minded people who feel the need to communicate with each other. The same idea can be depicted in another form. Similarly, egregores are created by the so-called dark forces. The only significant difference is the absence of a fiery body in the black magician who initiated, for example, the creation of egregofascism in Germany in the last century. The black magician, with his subtle body, affects the subtle body of Hitler and his closest accomplices. And together, they give rise to the core of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And then what happens is what we know from the history textbooks. A tragedy that distorted the fate of millions of people. Atheists often ask religious people the question, why does God, if, in your opinion, he really exists, allow such monsters of the human race as Hitler, his inner circle, to come to power and commit monstrous atrocities in their cruelty?
Приходить к власти и совершать чудовищные по своей жестокости злодеяния.
The hierarchy of light, which guides the evolution of humanity, of course, tries to protect us from all kinds of suffering and troubles, just as parents would like only the best for their children. But we know that even good parents sometimes have such children among their children that neither warmth and affection, nor severity and punishment help. Contrary to outwardly quite favorable conditions, a callous, vicious egoist grows up. And this is due to the fact that the determining factor in this case is not education, but the fiery accumulation in the bowl, with the scarcity of which a good person will not be able to become under any circumstances. One life is too little to significantly change our inner world, which has been formed over many previous incarnations. In the past history of mankind, for too long, people considered material well-being as the main value, and not moral values. Religious ministers, though they tried to intimidate their flock with the horrors of the afterlife for those who violate the commandments of God, but it didn't help much. As a result, a large number of individuals appeared, who for many lifetimes in a row developed only their mind, and not their soul. They were ready to commit any dirty deeds in order to achieve power and wealth. Deception, meanness, violence, up to the point of killing their competitors or abusers. Wars, including the Second World War, started by Hitler, are only a consequence of the vicious lifestyle of many individuals. In order for humanity to evolve in the direction of the ethical precepts contained in the scriptures of different peoples, there are power structures in the subtle worlds called the Lords of Karma. They influence the egregores and the individuals included in these egregores in such a way that violations of divine laws are punished with suffering, and their observance is encouraged by luck and expanding opportunities to serve people around them, which is accompanied by feelings of joy and happiness. For example, those who have abused violence against others in one or more consecutive lives are placed in conditions from childhood where they themselves will suffer beatings and humiliation. Those who, having wealth and luxury, were not engaged in charity and patronage, did not donate part of the funds to help others, will have to experience extreme need in the next lives. In the teaching of living ethics, the fiery world to paragraph 237, there are such words. The ignorant will ask, we have blasphemed everything higher many times, and yet we exist. No fire has burned us, and nothing threatens us. Then we'll take them to the square, where blind beggars grovel in the mud and say, "Here are you too."
И скажем: вот, тоже вы.
Shall we lead them to the dungeon? Shall we take you to the mines? We will lead them to fires, we will lead them to executions. Let's say, don't you recognize yourself?
Разве не узнаете себя?
Only the thread with the higher ones was cut off, and you were flying into the abyss.
И вы летели в бездну.
There is no need to intimidate. Life is full of examples of such horrors. The above examples emphasized only some clearly prominent, conspicuous manifestations of character.
Выпирающие и бросающиеся в глаза проявления характера.
But for the most part, people are not incorrigible villains or outstanding altruists and saints.
Альтруистами и святыми.
Inside each person, many disadvantages and a considerable number of different advantages get along quite well.
И немалое количество разных достоинств.
Accordingly, the surrounding conditions reflect this duality.
Отражают эту двойственность.
In some ways, we are lucky and we achieve the desired
Мы
goals.
достигаем желаемых целей.
And at the same time, troubles and bad luck are falling on us in other areas.
Неприятности и невезение.
And the brighter the personality, the more often it is contradictory.
Зачастую более она противоречива.
The impact of egregors on a person is stronger the more time he devotes to any of
Чем
them.
больше времени он посвящает какому-либо из них.
Someone has broad interests and a large circle of friends in various spheres of life. Someone is a fanatical follower of only one egregor and devotes all his free time to it.
И ему посвящает все свое свободное время.
However, this is typical as a rule for quite developed people, and is most often associated with professional activities in the field of science, art, politics, religion, or business. As for ordinary people, they are under the influence of many different egregors, the most influential of which are family, homeland.
Наиболее влиятельными из которых являются семья, родина.
In a broad sense, it is a state, and in a narrow sense, it is a place where a person has lived most of his life. Profession and several hobbies.
И несколько увлечений, хобби.
The great ancient Greek thinker Plato uttered a very important philosophical formula many centuries ago.
Изрек очень важную философскую формулу.
Ideas rule the world.
Правят миром.
The doctrine of goodwill clarifies ideas rule the world through the medium of egregors. Any idea needs someone to formulate it in simple and accessible words, so that there are people who would agree with the proposed formulation and want to put it into practice.
Сформулировал в простых и доступных словах, чтобы нашлись люди, которые бы согласились с предложенной формулировкой и захотели ее реализовать на практике.
It is necessary that someone lead this group of like-minded people and unite their joint efforts.
Совместные усилия.
All this inevitably generates an egregor.
Эгрегор.
Let's take a little more detail about how any mature egregor works.
Зрелости эгрегор.
It necessarily has a leader who unites all members of the group into a single whole and is endowed with the greatest fullness of power.
И наделенный наибольшей полнотой власти.
He inherited power either by inheritance, or by election, or by seizing it by force, or because he himself created this group.
Или потому что он сам создал данную группу.
Graphically depict this position with the icon czar.
Пиктограммой царь.
In a large egregor, the head always has assistants who are specialists in one of the areas.
Являются специалистами по какому-то из направлений.
They are also engaged in managerial work, but with limited powers.
Полномочий.
They have no right to make some decisions without consulting their supervisor.
не посоветовавшись со своим руководителем.
Let's graphically depict this position with the manager's icon.
Программой управленца.
Any egregor has to act surrounded by other egregors,
Окружение других эгрегоров.
and so that they do not interfere with the implementation of the plans, it is necessary to protect your do not proceed to the ring.
Не приступи к кольцу.
It can be a physical attack in order to eliminate a competitor or take away his available resources. It can also be a mental attack, with the aim of discrediting through the media, for the sake of seizing power or luring members of the egregor to himself.
Через средства массовой информации ради захвата власти или переманивания к себе членов эгрегора.
Therefore, in large groups, there are usually power structures whose representatives we will depict with the pictogram security.
Которых изобразим пиктограммой охрана.
The leader of an egregor does not always have to have extensive knowledge and a well-developed intellect. This is not enough to rally around a large community of people of various levels of development and specialized skills.
Разного уровня развития и специализированных умений.
It is more important to have charisma, a strong-willed or, conversely, a spiritual beginning, the ability to get along with people, remember their names and biographies, the ability to competently combine rewards and punishments.
Способность грамотно сочетать поощрение и наказание.
But, of course, no manager can do without the help of highly qualified specialists in various fields of activity.
Высококвалифицированных специалистов в различных сферах деятельности.
For this kind of employees, we will use the scientist's icon.
Использовать пиктограмму ученые.
The difference between managers and scientists is that the former lead people, while the latter are advisors in complex technical issues, and offer various technologies.
Советниками в сложных технических вопросах и предлагают различные технологии.
In other words, they are not responsible for who, where, and when will do something, but how and with what technical means.
Каким образом и с помощью каких технических средств.
No one, even a very small egregor, can do without those who are the direct executors of a wide variety of manual or mechanized work, up to cleaning rooms and carrying heavy loads.
Вплоть до уборки помещений и переноски тяжестей.
We will use the worker's icon for them.
Использовать пиктограмму рабочие.
Speaking about the impact of egregors on people's consciousness, it is impossible not to mention also the spheres that influence the formation of our morality and aesthetic tastes. For those responsible for these areas, we apply the pictograms religion and art. And now let's depict all the participants of an arbitrary egregor together. Most often, it will be a hierarchical pyramid, at the top of which there is a leader. A little lower, senior managers and security officers. Even lower, representatives of science and art. And finally, the bases of the pyramid will be filled with workers of various specialties. All of these positions are also arranged in the form of a pyramid of power. This applies to managers, law enforcement agencies, and scientists. Even among workers, there is a kind of hazing, in which more experienced and qualified workers can command less experienced youth to some extent. The same applies to the rank and file in the army, from which the term grandfather, used in this context, actually originated. According to the number of people entering the egregor, there can be a variety of options. It can be one person, several people, tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, and even billions of people.
Сотни, тысячи, миллионы и даже миллиарды людей.
The most numerous and powerful egregores today are the states.
Являются государства.
The largest of them are China, India, and the United States, which ensure the integrity of a group of several hundred million citizens.
Из нескольких сотен миллионов граждан.
The power at the same time does not always depend on the number of members of the egregor. The quality of their consciousness is much more important. Therefore, the so-called developed countries of the West have the greatest influence on the world economy and politics. In fact, all the peoples of the earth, humanity as a whole, are also collectively an egregor. And the day is not far off when the planet will have a single leader, unified power structures, a management system, and other components of the pyramid. Only then will all wars end on Earth, and there will be no need to spend huge amounts of money on the design, production, and operation of atomic weapons, aircraft carriers, and similar expensive hardware. Why do wars happen? The reason is the desire of strong states to seize from other, weaker ones, with the help of their military potential, their material resources, territory, minerals, means of production, impose their ideology, political, religious, national, and expand their sphere of influence in the outside world.
Навязать свою идеологию, политическую, религиозную, национальную, и расширить сферу своего влияния во внешнем мире.
For what? In order for the residents of the aggressor country to live more comfortably.
Комфортнее было жить.
The leaders of different egregors within each country are also concerned about the same. But there they are somehow restrained by the laws and the security forces monitoring their implementation. As for international law, it often turns out to be powerless against superpowers seeking to achieve their selfish interests, with the help of armies and modern highly effective weapons.
С помощью армий и современного высокоэффективного вооружения.
The only hope of all weak countries is for the United Nations, which is gaining more and more weight and influence, and the steady growth of public opinion that opposes all types of violence.
И неуклонный рост общественного мнения, противодействующего всем видам насилия.
It is very important to understand that a single person is also a complicated egregor. His muscular system is an analog of the low-skilled working masses. The emotional world manifests itself in the ability to sing, draw, dance, tell funny stories, and so on. The human mind fulfills the role of a king, a scientist, and a leader. Conscience is responsible for ethics and morality. Very often, there is no unity and harmony inside this small egregor. There, as well as in large egregors, wars sometimes last for many years between good and evil, spirituality and materialism, intelligence and rudeness, refined taste and pop music, a healthy lifestyle, and those desires, the realization of which destroys health.
Здоровым образом жизни и теми желаниями, реализация которых разрушает здоровье.
Just as there are many political parties and religious denominations within the state, so within the egregor of an individual, the most diverse set of different views, habits, beliefs, and philosophical concepts are intertwined in one tangle.
Самое пестрое множество разных взглядов, привычек, убеждений и философских концепций.
During his life, his inner world is sometimes shaken by revolutions. As a result, there are significant changes in outlook and life interests. Not only people, but also smaller egregors can be located on the steps of the pyramid of the big egregor. They can even be associations from several countries. For example, in recent decades, the United States of America has achieved a leading position on the planet in imposing its ideological beliefs, so-called democratic rights and freedoms, economic interests on less developed countries, exploiting the cheap labor of undeveloped countries and their minerals, and cultural manifestations, especially in the field of cinema and various shows. Thanks to the advent of personal computers and the Internet, it became possible to create egregors in a virtual environment. This, on the one hand, allowed a person to get as close as possible to the conditions in which he will exist after the death of his physical shell, and on the other hand, showed him how effectively the thought creation of people united by common interests affects the mass consciousness.
Мыслетворчество, объединенных общими интересами людей.
Moreover, without the need to gather in squares or in the palaces of congresses, pay for office rent or expensive propaganda products, risk health due to physical violence from militant representatives of other aggressors who are accustomed to achieve their rightness, not by force of arguments, but by punching or using various kinds of weapons. For example, different philosophical concepts are discussed at an esoteric forum. This is a typical virtual egregor. There is a leader, there are his assistants managers. Both of them also perform the function of law enforcement officers, who monitor that the laws proposed by the forum administration are not violated. Instead of execution, eternal ban; instead of prison, shutdown for a long time. Moreover, those who easily apply such measures for dissent in their egregor, about leaders acting not in virtual, but in real life, can say that they are dictators, that their hands are covered in blood, and they themselves, in fact, are no different from them, because they act on the principle of there is no man, no problem. What is the difference between the top of the egregor pyramid, which we will call the elite, and those who are at the bottom of it? The fact that it is she who imposes laws. Sometimes I use totalitarian methods, sometimes I disguise myself as a democracy. In any case, the leader surrounds himself with those who are interested in his rule, and are able to help manage those who are at the bottom or in opposition. The more significant his help, the higher the places on the steps of the pyramid. You can help in various ways, both by force, punishing those in your unit who try to violate the laws in force in the egregor, and by humanitarian means, creating works of art pleasing to the ruling regime. To get to the top steps of the pyramid, you need to be a developed person, or, by analogy, a developed egregor. That is, to have abilities in some sphere of activity, accumulation of life experience, knowledge, strong-willed qualities.
Знания, волевые качества.
The ability to properly build relationships with people or with aggregors. To give in to someone or show friendliness, to suppress someone or keep at a distance, to stimulate someone or vice versa. To show indifference.
Кого-то стимулировать или наоборот, проявлять равнодушие.
Gregor's powers can be strengthened with the help of a team of employees, preferably of high quality, that is, highly qualified in some area.
Высокую квалификацию в какой-то области.
The fact that there are people of different development is a universally recognized fact that does not need proof. The same can be said about aggregors. Only here, until people have learned to use their advancement in a positive way. In the most negative form, this manifests itself in the form of wars. For example, the leaders of the German people, very advanced, it is indisputable, led by Hitler, decided that they are the chosen, the best nation on the planet. And that, therefore, it is necessary to seize the whole world by force of arms and control it, destroying those whom they considered undeveloped peoples, bombing from airplanes and burning in the gas chambers of concentration camps. In some ways, a similar idea has taken hold of the American people, who are also quite developed. They are confident that they are the leaders of humanity and have the right to solve their national interests at the expense of the resources of other peoples with the help of force and not only weapons, but also economic sanctions, ideological propaganda, the imposition of their culture.
Но и экономическими санкциями, идеологической пропагандой, навязыванием своей культуры.
The experience of 2 world wars in the 20th century has shown how tragic such ideas turn out to be. And in order to prevent such disasters of a planetary scale from happening again, the victorious states of fascism created the United Nations, designed to formulate some general planetary laws that prevent wars.
Призванные сформулировать некие общепланетарные законы, препятствующие войнам.
It includes almost all the states of the Earth. But, let's be honest, only a few countries have the most powerful influence on decision-making.
Наиболее мощно влияют всего несколько стран.
And the United States of America is pushing its interests especially hard.
Соединенные Штаты Америки.